Cardinal News is telling the little-known stories of Virginia's role in our country's march to independence. As we head toward America's 250th anniversary, we'll examine the events, people, and places that shaped the Commonwealth and the nation. Together we can better understand the role of our ancestors beyond what's in the history books. This is Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission.
Hello and welcome to Cardinal News 250. I'm Lisa Rowan, filling in for Dutchy Jesse. We want to thank you for listening. Cardinal News 250 is sponsored by Bank of Botetourt, focused on you. And this project is made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. Today, we're joined by Virginia-born journalist Andrew Lawler. His latest book is A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. Hi, Andrew. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Lisa. How are you?
Great. We are very excited to have you for what we're going to have as a two-part interview on the events of the American Revolution in November and December-ish of 1775. Our first part today focuses on Lord Dunmore's Emancipation Proclamation that offered freedom to some enslaved people, but there was a catch. So let's start off by just setting the scene for people who maybe are like me and weren't in Virginia for fourth grade for all of the local history. Just give us a short reminder of, who Lord Dunmore was, and then sort of put us in the moment in fall of 1775 for Lord Dunmore.
Sure. Well, Virginia, of course, was the largest and most powerful and richest colony of the 13 colonies. And Lord Dunmore was the royal governor chosen by King George III to run the place. Although the place actually was run by the tobacco planters who made up most of the House of Burgesses. So by November of 1775, Lord Dunmore had been forced to leave Williamsburg, the capital. He'd set up a base at Gosport, the Gosport shipyard, now the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, just outside of Norfolk in today's Portsmouth. And his goal was to create a base from which he could battle these troublesome rebels. But the trouble was that the British government was unwilling to send large numbers of men or ships to support him. So he didn't have the reinforcement. So there he is, needing the men to combat this growing patriot army under Patrick Henry. And by November of 1775, large numbers of enslaved people had left their forced labor camps and had shown up at Gosport and on these Royal Navy ships asking for sanctuary. He granted them sanctuary. So he already had a pool of people sitting there who were willing to actually, face potential imprisonment or torture or even execution for having deserted to the British side. So he had a ready pool of people who were highly motivated to fight for the king's cause.
So when we're thinking about this Emancipation Proclamation that he issued in November of 1775, it sounds like he already had some enslaved people who had come and were willing to, join up with him. They had come to him for sanctuary. He issues this proclamation. What did this proclamation state, and how universal was it?
Well, I think the important thing to remember is that it was really the enslaved people who forced Dunmore's hand. If they had not shown up, then it's pretty clear he wouldn't have issued any kind of proclamation. But they were showing up in large numbers, probably in the hundreds. So he realized that there were a large pool of people who were willing to fight. So he issued this proclamation in the wake of the Battle of Kemp's Landing, which took place on November 15th, 1775. And it's interesting. What happened was there was a black man armed with a sword who captured the militia commander, the Patriot militia commander who had ambushed Dunmore's forces. And what's so ironic is that the man who captured the Patriot militia commander was owned by that militia commander. So Dunmore clearly was very impressed by the bravery shown by this man and other Black Virginians. So that's what clearly sparked his decision to launch this proclamation. Now, what did the proclamation say? It was very much like Abraham Lincoln's. It was not a full-scale emancipation like Lincoln's. It was very limited. Basically, if you came to Lord Dunmore and you were willing to fight for the king and you were owned by a patriot, then you would be freed. Not next year, but immediately. So from what we can tell, several hundred black men showed up. They were freed, and they became part of what was known as the Ethiopian Regiment, the first black corps in the British Army.
So we have these, able-bodied people who said, "Yes, I'm going to fight for you." This was not a sort of you could be freed and then go about your life. This was to serve specifically as a part of this effort.
Well, not entirely, because we do know that there were a lot of women and children who also came to live behind British lines. And we don't really know if they were emancipated, but we do know that the vast majority of those people were not forced to go back to their owners. They, in fact, were part of the British camp. So this wasn't purely a mercenary effort on Dunmore's part. I think that he was smart enough to see that if he wanted to really create a very good fighting force, that he also needed to ensure that their families were taken care of, because otherwise, why would they fight? So having their families there was clearly part of the motivation for these men to risk their lives yet again, because they risked their lives simply by leaving their plantations, but to risk their lives fighting on the side of Dunmore.
Tell me about the reaction to this. Obviously, we have enslaved people who are saying, "Yes, we're going to come and we're going to, respond to this." But what was the reaction sort of around those people?
Well, imagine the difficulty of choosing whether or not to risk your life and that of your family to leave, your enslaved position, say, somewhere on Mount Vernon or Monticello, in order to reach potential freedom. You don't know for sure whether to trust Dunmore. You don't know what's really happening. The news is very minimal. So hundreds of thousands of people faced extremely difficult choices with limited information. And that partly is because the Patriots immediately launched a propaganda campaign to denigrate Dunmore. They wanted to convince their enslaved labor, that they shouldn't trust this man, that he was going to sell them to the West Indies, that he was a drunk, that he was a lecher, that he was not trustworthy. So this was a very conscious campaign on the part of the Patriots to really convince these people to stay put. Basically saying, you think life is bad now, just wait till you're shipped off to a sugar plantation in Jamaica. So this was part of this propaganda effort that the Patriots immediately put into play as soon as the Emancipation Proclamation was made public.
And what about the effect on Lord Dunmore's army? Once you have people who are willing to take this risk, they have this limited information, but they say, "We're going to do this." And I don't want to give away too much about the next part that we're going to talk about, but is there anything you can say about at this phase, the how this impacted Lord Dunmore to have, these people join him and that reaction from the Patriots?
Well, I think one thing that we should keep in mind is that he called this regiment Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. He put his name on it, and also he called them Ethiopian, which was actually a term of respect used by Europeans toward Africans, maybe the only term of respect. It was a Christian country, a very ancient country, even though most of these people obviously were from West Africa, not from East Africa. So I think that gives you a clue to Dunmore's attempt to create some kind of dignity for these people. Now, he had to throw this army together very quickly. Remember, there are some 1,500 patriots marching from Williamsburg to Norfolk at this point. So he only has a matter of weeks to take people who, most of whom had never touched a gun, and turn them into a fighting force. So this was the big challenge that Dunmore faced. With an army marching toward him, he had to create an army virtually out of nothing.
So we're going to leave that sort of cliffhanger for people as they're thinking about what happens when they all get to Norfolk. But I want to go back to something you said earlier about comparisons to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Tell us a little bit about how Lord Dunmore's proclamation was sort of a precursor to Lincoln's.
For reasons that we don't have to discuss here, but historians have really not drawn the link between these two proclamations. One very famous, Lincoln's 1863 proclamation, and Dunmore's, which is more obscure. But Dunmore's radical document, remember, this is the first Emancipation Proclamation ever issued in the entire British Empire. So it had a huge impact. In the subsequent years, several British generals, like General Clinton, also put out emancipation proclamations because the king and Parliament did not contradict Dunmore's proclamation. So they basically said, we're nervous about this, but maybe it'll help us win the war. And so other British generals chimed in and said, yes, let's see if we can get Black Americans to side with the crown. So this created, basically, Dunmore's proclamation created an opening for people to draw on the Black Americans in exchange for freedom in order to fight the revolution. This then happened as well in the War of 1812. And by the time the Civil War rolled around, several abolitionists argued with Lincoln that Dunmore's proclamation and those that followed were the legal precedents that the president needed to put out a proclamation which he worried would be challenged by Congress and the Supreme Court. So if you take away Dunmore's proclamation, it's very difficult to see how you get to Lincoln's decree.
That's interesting. One other question that I have, and so I'm going to mentally skip us ahead until after the events of 1775 and early 76. And I want to ask you about the people who took the offer by Dunmore to leave their owners and join his armed forces. Do we know what happened to those people after all of this? What took place? Did they end up going back to their owners? Just can you, what do we know about them?
It's a very fascinating tale that really has not been explored in depth until fairly recently. Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment leaves Virginia in August of 1776. Dunmore takes them to New York, where a British fleet has just arrived to try and force George Washington, the Continental Army, out of New York. So they actually take part in the Battle of Long Island to push the Continentals out of New York City. And from then on, many of these men and their families, who also accompanied them, they continued to fight for the British throughout the war, often as part of what was called the Black Pioneers Unit, kind of an engineering unit. And at the end, of course, the tragedy was that when the British lost the war and were evacuating New York, these people were liable to be re-enslaved. George Washington himself, sad to say, sent slave catchers into British-occupied New York in order to get back those enslaved people who had deserted to Dunmore. Now, fortunately, the British decided that it would be dishonorable for them to turn these people back over to the Americans to be re-enslaved. Many of them had been free for 7 or 8 years. So instead, they helped them to evacuate mostly to Nova Scotia, where at least 3,000 Black Americans who had fought for the British were reestablished at a place there called Birchtown. So we know this because there's a book called The Book of Negroes, where the British actually listed everyone who got on the ships. And many of them had fought for Dunmore, and many of them were women and children who had come with Dunmore from Virginia.
That's amazing.
And I should add that what's really interesting is that many of those people who went to Nova Scotia ended up going back to Africa, where they founded Sierra Leone, the first home for emancipated enslaved Africans in the world.
Wow. That is truly amazing. Well, we are going to leave it here. We are going to be back for part 2. We're going to find out what happens when everyone starts going to Norfolk. But for now, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure, Lisa.
You can find out more about Andrew's other books and writings at www.andrewlawler.com. Lawler is spelled Lawler. Thank you for listening to Cardinal News 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. We also want to thank Bank of Botetourt, focused on you. And thanks to Sean Eddy of Eddy Alexander and Zach Shelton for technical support. You can read all our Cardinal 250 stories and sign up for the Cardinal 250 newsletter at cardinalnews.org. I'm Lisa Rowan. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for listening to Cardinal 250, made possible in part by funding from the Virginia American Revolution 250 Commission. For more information on Cardinal News 250, including the Cardinal 250 and other newsletters, visit cardinalnews.org.